Our first speakers, Ben, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to you, are Ben Fearing and John Bausch from Strategic Talent Solutions. Ben, you're welcome to go ahead and share your screen. Good morning, John. So thank you both for joining us today. So I understand that over at STS, you all recently surveyed executives on COVID-19 and its impact on business. And I just want to remind all of our participants that this morning, Michelle Bernie Parker sent out a link to the survey for STS. So if you could please go ahead and do that or look for that, that would be great. So what did you guys learn? John, Ben?
Actually, thank you so much, John. It's an honor for Ben and me to be part of this, and I hope all the participants this morning and this afternoon and from yesterday have gained a lot of value. I know it's been a lot of hard work for you and your team to pull this together. We confirmed a lot of what we assumed we would learn when we did the survey. And what we'd like to do, with everyone's permission, is walk through a little bit about the methodology that STS uses when we coach leaders, when we work with leadership teams. We're going to tee up our framework first, then we're going to show you how the framework works through an application. And then Ben is going to walk through the survey results. And the reason we've set it up this way is our survey was actually designed to test against our 5 disciplines of leaders. So with that, I just want to talk a little bit about our objectives for today. The first is to outline what we call our 5 disciplines of a leader. It's a very practical model. There are some research underpinnings that we've got, but it's really about creating insight and action for leaders. So we're gonna overview our 5 disciplines of leaders. The next thing we're going to do is really discuss the executive feedback responding to what at the time was the COVID-19 crisis, with survey data and analysis. And obviously, since COVID-19 has come on, there have been other issues that are affecting credit unions and financial services. And then we're going to share some of our experience working with senior leaders and executive teams. And we're very happy to take questions as they come up. And if you want to wait until the panel, that's also okay. I'll be joining the other 3 speakers at 1 o'clock Eastern. So why 5 disciplines? How did STS come up with this model? How does it work? We actually took a step back a few years ago and did some primary and secondary research on what made leaders effective. What were the behaviors or competencies that leaders who were successful demonstrated? And we wanted to use a behavioral model because you can learn new behaviors. And what we discovered was that there were 5 things that successful leaders do, or there are 5 things that people who want to be successful leaders should do. And the first discipline of a leader needs to be is to create a credible strategy for his or her part of the organization. Whether you're the CEO of the organization or you're an individual contributor who might play a leadership role on project teams, it's critically important that you have a plan. And when we say credible strategy, what we're talking about is setting priorities, creating plans that move beyond a function and that elevate the likelihood of success of an organization. And strategy is a word that gets kicked around a lot. It sounds like a big word. We try to keep it simple and just say strategy is the logic that moves your organization from point A to point B. It's why you want to do it, what you're going to do, and how you're going to do it. And the most important part of leadership and creating credible strategies is also being able to articulate what you're not going to do. And we're going to, and if you have questions about this, Ben's more likely because he's the PhD and has a deeper knowledge in statistics. But we've actually validated this through both primary and secondary research that People who don't have plans will fail as leaders. So you have to have a plan. So we anchor on creating a credible strategy. The next 4 disciplines, we have them in an order, but they can be in any order that you want. But our research and our beliefs show that you need to start with a plan. Logically, if you have a credible strategy, a plan, then the next step is to build and develop winning teams. You need to organize, create an org structure, create a framework for the strategic imperatives that need to get done, what we call big rocks. You need to organize those big rocks in a way that makes logical sense for the organization, so that someone can look at your org structure and say, oh, this org structure makes sense because of the strategy or the plan that you've created. And once you've set up your org structure, then you need to put people into the right boxes. And most leaders, when we explain this to them or we share this model with them, most leaders start with structure and then put people into it. Some leaders actually start with people and design the structure. Either way works as long as you're being intellectually honest about what approach you're using. And this is where org structures also need to be viewed as living, breathing things. So if you don't have exactly the right people for the right structure, you have to break your structure into smaller pieces so you can give people the opportunity to be successful, leading whatever part of your strategic intent that you wish. The third discipline is around mobilizing stakeholders. In any business, there's a natural tension that exists. In any healthy business, there's a natural tension that exists between functions, geographies, even strategic plans. Salespeople want to sell everything. Credit people want to limit the amount of risk that the credit union is going to take on. There's a natural tension there. And if there isn't natural tension, the organization's not going to move forward. Mobilizing stakeholders is about making sure that everyone understands the strategy, the roles of people, and that there's good dialogue and effective communication around vision and strategy. Yes, salesperson, I know you want to sell, but we need to make sure that we're selling the right product at the right price to manage our risk. Having that dialogue is not about politics. We like to frame it as diplomacy, where both sides need to be heard, both sides need to feel like they've won, and both sides are able to come back to the table and continue that robust discussion or debate. The fourth discipline is around driving results. So if a leader has a credible strategy, they've set up the right structure, they have the right team, and they're having the right debates, then leaders need to be providing oversight and making sure that they're inspecting that the work that needs to be done is being done. And that involves setting expectations, allowing debate with the person who you're delegating to, delegating, holding people accountable, focusing on results, and being transparent. So leaders will inspect the work. They'll do business reviews or functional reviews or performance reviews. And it hinges on tying the expectation of what you need that function, that person, that group to do back to your strategy, and then holding them accountable for delivering results. The final discipline is evolving the business or change. You'll recall that I said that we proved through primary and secondary research that you have to have a credible strategy if you're going to be successful as a leader. We are halfway to proving that you need to have a change agenda if you're going to be a successful leader. In fact, part of strategy is forward thinking and looking out the windshield, anticipating change. Leading change is also part of what leaders need to do. So the 5 disciplines are create a credible strategy, build and develop winning teams, mobilize stakeholders, drive results, and evolve the business. We had a lot of questions when we rolled this out to clients, mostly around isn't org structure and talent management, aren't they two different things? And shouldn't there be 6 disciplines? And through discussions with clients, including key credit unions that we consult with, the realization came that those two are so interrelated that it just made sense to have 5 disciplines rather than 6. By the way, I should have mentioned at the beginning, you'll get a copy of these slides and a copy of our survey results. So I hope you're not furiously taking notes. I apologize if you were. So let's talk a little bit about how you can apply the 5 disciplines. Well, let's just say that you're cruising along, life is really good, you've got your business plan set, your fiscal year starts in January, you're on your way to a great first quarter, and then say a pandemic hits, or mortgage rates drop, and suddenly you have an influx of business that you didn't anticipate, or you have a challenge that you didn't anticipate in terms of having to deploy your employees in a different way. How could you use the 5 disciplines? The first thing that we would recommend is go back and evaluate your strategy. As you're going to see, most of the executives that we surveyed did reevaluate their strategy, and they didn't change it that much. They anticipated some differences on the results they were going to get based on the pandemic, based on economic unrest, and then some social unrest. But they reevaluated their strategy. Org structures really didn't change in most organizations because of the pandemic. There were some differences. For example, we consult with a company that's in the food industry. Their consumer business product literally was flying off the shelves. Their food service business dried up almost overnight. So they had to do some structural changes. But most of the work around building and developing teams had to do with redeploying people. For example, redeploying employees that were in branches into call centers. Mobilizing stakeholders became mission critical. Over communicating during the pandemic has been the major thing that we've seen leaders do. Driving results, expectations had to be reset. With high volume mortgages, profitability for credit unions may have changed or been delayed from one quarter to another or one fiscal year to another. But volume became more important in making sure that you got all those applications in and completed. And change became really part of strategy. How are we going to manage through the crisis? How are we going to lead our organization and be stable when the pandemic ends and when interest rates start to come up and employment returns? So that's just a quick way of applying the 5 disciplines. So what's been going on in the world? Ben and I don't have to tell you this. It's been a heck of a year, and we want to start by, from an STS perspective, hoping and praying that none of you have been affected by COVID, that you haven't lost a loved one. We at STS have been blessed in our inner circle and our outer circle. We have not had to face that. But with COVID, the economy slowing down, unemployment going up, not sure when the stimulus packages are going to be approved. It's an election year, so there's a lot of positioning. And then the social unrest that started with George Floyd and the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been a challenging year for leaders. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ben, who's going to walk through our survey results. And I just want to remind you, we used our 5 disciplines to frame the survey and interpret the results.
Thanks, John. And I'd echo John's appreciation for being invited to participate today. So for the next few minutes, as John said, I'll walk you through the results of a survey we conducted earlier in the year. And our intent here is really to provide you with additional perspectives that can be useful as you continue to face an uncertain future and difficult decisions and challenges. And we think that hearing from other leaders, there's some comfort there, knowing that there are people out there in your industry and in other industries that are facing similar challenges with some resilience and optimism that we'll talk about. So to start, I'll invite you on a journey with me. I think it was about 5 years ago. It was April 2020. And at that time, infection rates were still high or climbing in a lot of major metropolitan areas. Unemployment rates hit over 14%, representing 20.5 million jobs. CARES Act had been approved with the PPP Act. You had PPP loans rather, but the rules were being written as we went, as checks were being cut. And it became really clear to parents like myself that our kids weren't going to go back to school in-person learning anytime soon, which might explain any noises you hear in the background today. It was also really unclear with the gating criteria at that time, how the economy was going to open back up, particularly across different states and regions in the area. And so that's the colorful background and backdrop that this survey data was gathered in. And as John noted, leaders were pretty candid and open with what they shared, but also pretty speculative at the time. And since then, you've had the social, political unrest, the continuing health concerns, obviously the economic questions. And so he didn't even mention the asteroid that could hit on November 2nd, although apparently NASA says we have nothing to worry about there, which is good. But the headlines here, which I think John referenced, really were some fundamental truths that were reinforced through this survey, particularly around, there are going to be some challenges to fundamentally how work gets done or where work gets done. Certainly some challenges to organizations and leaders about how agile their organizations were, their employees were, their cultures were. And then there were some fundamental truths that were solidified around that importance of clear communication that John referenced. We just kept hearing comments about the need for over communicating and really how to communicate with employees in an open, transparent, and vulnerable way about who you are, where you're going. And the importance of agility, and particularly in leaders in the face of a crisis and uncertainty and a challenge. And then this need to continue to develop and invest and engage employees even when you're in the midst of a storm. So with that, we'll jump into the survey details. So respondents included leaders across a wide variety of industries, as you can see there. Many of these folks found their ways of working significantly disrupted, although a number provided essential services throughout the quarantine, the stay-at-home orders, and the pandemic. As you can see, we also included, there were 7 respondents that identified as being part of financial services organizations, both banks and credit unions. And then in total, we had 35 respondents, 10 CEOs, 15 senior leaders in HR, so CHROs or VPs of HR, and then 10 executives either in the C-suite or reporting up to the C-suite. We also, and appreciate you guys completing the survey this morning. We got about 9 respondents so far. If we keep getting some of those, we'll certainly include those in the presentation that we share. I'll reference a bit of the data that came in this morning. So in terms of the specific questions we asked, there were 10 scaled questions. 5 of those you answered on the survey we sent out, and then 4 open-ended questions as well, really focusing on how they'd adjusted to the crisis, how leaders were supporting and engaging the organization and positioning them to remain viable, and really ultimately how they're getting people ready for what's next, that new normal that everyone was talking about at the time, or the next normal. And so we're going to be reviewing most of these questions today, but we'll also send a copy, as John said, of the full survey results. It includes the qualitative and quantitative analysis, and also our take on the feedback that we heard. And what we'll use is that 5 disciplines lens to help make sense of some of the insights that we heard from the organizations. All right, so you'll see on the survey results here, pretty standard scaling here, agree to strongly agree, a more neutral, slightly agree or slightly disagree, and then that disagree, strongly disagree. So we start with strategy, as John said. So that first discipline that answers the question, what's the plan, where are we headed? And this was really about the stability of the perceived long-term strategies for organizations. And as you can see, strong majority, 74% of executives felt their plans were pretty stable. And these were results mirrored by financial service organizations as part of this survey. And we took as generally a good sign overall, and kind of a welcome news. People knew their path they were on, they were staying the course at that moment. I will say some folks said that those perceptions of long-term stability of strategy were contingent on things getting better and getting better fairly quickly. So a little bit of concern if things didn't start to turn at that moment. And one leader noted that, their mission and the regulatory environment, that kept their long-term mission and strategy relatively stable. But what could change are most things around how work got done, the use of technology, the organization's sense of space, even how employees were recruited. And in their words said, all of those things could be profoundly altered, which is pretty significant, obviously. One thing we found in the survey for folks this morning, we had 9 respondents, and it was similar to these results. 75% agreed or strongly agreed that their strategy largely remained unchanged. 25% disagreed with that statement. So again, pretty consistent message even today that long-term direction is relatively stable. The next question, we're looking at more that the path to that long-term goal being maybe not as clear. So the question here is that market conditions have changed most of those short-term goals and objectives. So what are the results that are going to be achieved along the way? And so you see here again that same results, but 74% saying that those have been shifted, and this included financial service organizations, respondents, a small sample, but they agreed to this question as well. All of them, actually 100% said our actions have changed. There was a good bit shared here about the need to rapidly reprioritize and readjust goals and expectations for individual and group performance. And we didn't talk about, is this good or bad? It was more about the significance of the change. What we found when we surveyed folks this morning was about 63% agreed that their goals had changed. 25% were in that neutral zone and 12% disagreed. So again, that same story around long-term stability and short-term disruption in goals and objectives. Okay. Now, the last question here on this section was that a question around optimism, really, of growth opportunities showing up in this context. And so we didn't talk about were change good or bad. This maybe give us a picture of that. And so just under half the respondents thought that the conditions would provide growth opportunities in the long term. There were just a few financial services organizations that agreed with this item in that subset. And we actually only had 3 strongly agrees at all on this question. So really a more muted optimism in response to this opportunity for growth. When we look at the comments, really executives were citing the potential for increased M&A activity that could occur as the dust settled from the crisis. So in terms of kind of overall observations, CEOs tended to perceive or anticipate there's greater disruption in long-term and near-term strategies. I might leave it up to you guys to debate what that might mean. But what it does present is, at worst, there's potential misalignment at the top. But at best, I think there's a need, obviously, then to create that strong leadership alignment. Most believed that there was going to be more of a longer term recovery as opposed to this V-shaped rebound we heard a lot about at the time and still being talked about. So more of the feedback was anticipating either that U-shaped or even the W-shaped recession or the recovery given ongoing potential health crisis coming back. And then most leaders recognized the need for additional continuity plans. So they believe they had pretty robust plans in place. And this pandemic and stay-at-home orders really identified a lot of gaps or single point vulnerabilities. There was some resilience in operations noted by a few organizations that had more diverse or geographically dispersed supply chains that they could rely on. And so, for some teams, this crisis really helped organizations clarify very quickly their priorities, where investments needed to be made. A lot of leaders saw this as a chance to challenge their teams to make some hard calls on projects and initiatives that have been lingering. So it became a moment to really say, what's critical? What are we going to focus on? Are these things really important? Or are they just things you want to do? And other leaders spoke more about hitting pause than canceling. And so this idea of we're on the same path, we're just going a slightly different way. So we may have a different set of priorities or this pace, but we're not necessarily canceling those activities. I would say in the financial services space, some of the feedback we heard was that it wasn't on the products and services that were going to be delivered to customers and to members, more how they receive those services, which obviously has a lot of impact on both operational and technical outcomes and approaches. And then through all this, as we noted around the CEOs and the potential for misalignment, there was a need to bring those senior leadership teams together. And early on, again in April, there were concerns about how they were going to do that. You know, one leader said, it takes a lot of people, a lot of data, all in a room together for us to really evaluate and plan our strategy. And we're not sure when we're going to get to do that again. And while we haven't surveyed these folks again, our experience would tell us, and our assumption would be that leaders become more adept at using virtual tools in group settings, using breakout rooms, using things like Mural that allow for virtual workspaces and whiteboards. And we think that because we've certainly used those more with our clients, but also it's clear that this work around evaluating both long-term and short-term plans is likely going to be a more frequent activity over the next 12 to 18 months. John, anything you might add here in terms of the teams you've worked with, how they've evaluated their strategies?
I think the first, and we'll talk a little bit about this towards the end. I think there was, at least with most of my clients, about a 3 to 4 week crisis management, crisis leadership that occurred obviously in healthcare organizations that extended longer, especially those in hard-hit areas with COVID-19. But what I've seen is that drive results discipline, which ties back to strategy, is that instead of maybe quarterly business reviews, organizations move to monthly business reviews. Instead of monthly business reviews, organizations move to twice a month business reviews that included more scenario planning, more careful evaluation of data and trends, and candidly, better, more real-time feedback from frontline employees. So I actually saw better open communication in organizations that help drive better decisions around strategic intent. So the channels, the ability for the CEO or the C-suite to get just-in-time communication and data on how things were going during the crisis actually helped hone and shape the rhythm of assessing what projects were going to be paused. And I think, Ben, that's an important point that you raised. Not a lot of my clients or our clients, I believe, actually stopped projects and said, we're not going to do them. They paused projects to meet the business needs as their, in your case, members wanted them to.
Thanks, John. All right, so if we move forward, some items related to managing stakeholders and developing talent. And as I noted previously, John noted, one of the most prominent themes really was this need to communicate across and down the organization. And so what you see here is, this opportunity to respond in this crisis has been a chance to show commitment to core values and core mission. An example here, just that I have from one of my clients, is that an organization that I've worked with has typically been pretty tight with information. It's stayed at the top. It's a partnership, but it's a large organization. And in this environment, they had their first, albeit virtual, first all-employee, all-hands meeting in their 100-year history. And with that and other changes, I don't actually think it's surprising that their engagement results in the midst of all of this rose fairly significantly. Employees were wanting to both hear and be heard, and that was one of our clients who made that shift and saw the importance of it. What we've noticed here again, that this need for providing meaning and clarity and confidence about who we are, what we're about, why we're about here, what brings us together was important. 100% of financial service organizations agreed with this item that we surveyed. And I would say comments around, the organizations that really rely on mission and core values. So those like credit unions, those that had opportunities to provide meaningful impact on their communities, really noted that this was a key part of how they communicated and engaged their employees during this time. It also highlights, this survey doesn't necessarily highlight the communications externally. Most of it was internal, but we did see comments about the need to start shifting at that time already to external stakeholders, so to members and customers, so that people understand where you're going, what you're about. And we saw a lot of that, particularly again, in the social unrest and organizations. Once we got past the "we're here for you" emails, which everyone was sending, it was then really this statement around your perspective on diversity, inclusion, and equity. So about 2/3 agree that the response here helped them see that they have a strong leadership team, a strong bench of leaders and high potential leaders for the future. And so we know that these last several months have tested the capabilities of even the best leaders. And it's encouraging that for some organizations, this has been a chance for people to step up. It's been a reality check in other cases too. Some leaders haven't been able to meet the expectation, kind of rise to the challenge. One leader noted that, people leadership, not just kind of performance management, but true people leadership was already a challenge. Communication was already a challenge going into this crisis. And this period really just reinforced that it's something that had to be addressed. The importance and impact of not addressing was really felt. In terms of attendee data, we had 100% of our respondents agree with this item. Again, it's great to know that the folks that we're talking to today are seeing people step up, identifying the capabilities of their organizations. And then the last question here, about half respondents felt that the work for driving results, how you manage others, how you develop others was going to change dramatically. It's notable and maybe somewhat surprising that the degree of change that has been experienced or is expected in how work is being conducted, that not all organizations felt like it was going to really shift leader expectations. At least not as significantly as we might have expected. We did certainly see a lot of feedback on the recognition that how employees are developed would shift and change. An emphasis certainly on remote learning. One HR leader said, I couldn't get people really engaged in remote learning. Well, now they don't have a choice, and we're getting people bought into that model. But there's some of those opportunities both to connect with employees, to develop employees, for employees themselves, to develop with others as they interact with people, just simply in the hallway bumping into folks. Those were changing and shifting. And so there's a need to be, in all cases, really much more intentional about how leaders engage and connected and developed employees. What we found was there was so much clear direction on how often people needed and were expected to be checking in. It could be that the expectations were already there, that the expectations of leading a remote workforce, which involves a good bit of time to interact and check in and see how people are doing, was the expectation. We've just now been a bit more explicit and pushing that forward, given the concern of how we deal with remote workforce. All right. John, did you have any insights here on how leaders are managing remote workers in terms of that what and how? I know we've talked a good bit about.
I would just, I'd probably put an exclamation point, Ben, on the last statement that you made. Leaders have to be way more intentional, and we're seeing this, way more intentional in terms of reaching out to their teams, especially their high potential employees, their high performing employees. The thank you text messages, the thank you phone calls, the all employee meetings with call outs to employees. I would say 4 of my clients have regularly scheduled all employee meetings, and the senior leadership team is calling out individuals for their good work. I think the performance management side has been easier for leaders. I do think there's going to be a challenge for how to develop people and give them the right opportunities and that just-in-time feedback that usually happens right before a meeting or right after a meeting. There's going to have to be a way to find out how to do that in a cadence that really benefits the organization and the high potential employee. I think the behavior is there. I just think finding new avenues is going to have to be, is the challenge for leaders.
Thanks, John. So again, leaders emphasized that core values were critical in engaging their organizations. And that idea of transparency and patience, empathy, and really you could add vulnerability to the mix was really key in making sure people were informed, involved, engaged, that they felt heard. I have an executive I work closely with, and she was going to hold a department-led strategy and meeting. It was her entire department, all virtual, obviously. And it was the day after some fairly violent social unrest occurred in her city. And she elected to scrap the entire agenda. She facilitated dialogue with her team on those issues. And it took a good bit of maturity and skill to do that. But what I would say is to manage that conversation with care and conviction is really what made it effective. John and I have both worked with a leader, and this gentleman said, how do I get people to feel that I care about them? And I'll give John credit. He said, you have to care about them. It's an important step one. And so that genuine kind of reaching out and expressing that care and concern, expressing that vulnerability and that empathy, those have been key terms and concepts that we've worked with many leaders and leadership teams on going through this. And executives did note that there were, again, new leaders stepping up that distinguish themselves. Those capabilities that people are seeing around innovation and creativity, right? That agility and flexibility, being able to see what's possible and then move towards that. Often people who have been able to adopt kind of a new way of working, particularly the technological component of that, either pick it up or knew it already. And then a big one, again, was composure. So ability both in how you make decisions and how you engage employees, being able to keep your calm in those high emotional moments has really been a differentiator for folks. The opportunity here is to continue to develop and grow those folks that have stepped up. So the opportunity to kind of fan the flames of development and not lose sight. It's great you've identified people that have stood out. It's really important. Again, we'll go back to being intentional of how are you going to continue to develop those people in this moment, not just expect them to continue to elevate and develop. Another thing that's not noted here around talent strategies was this perspective that the available talent pool for certain roles might significantly be expanded if you drop geographical restrictions. So this requirement to move someone, if that goes away, where we're all virtual, who else could we hire? Where else could we look for talent? It remains to be seen if people are really integrating that into a talent acquisition strategy, but it certainly was intriguing, and you saw a number of leaders citing that as at least something as a positive, perhaps, coming through this new way of working. This also relates, though, to the broadening of talent pools that would support that renewed and increased focus on diversity and inclusion. As you increase, again, the breadth of your talent pool and the people that might be hired, and as you increase the flexibility of where people work, how they can work, both of those could support adjustments to that pipeline. So the last set of questions here are really about transformative changes that organizations have gone through. This is really where that, as John said, that discipline of evolving the business, seeing what's next, feeds into your strategy and what you need to accomplish. So the first item here, I find pretty phenomenal, to be honest. So 80% said that their transition was seamless. I don't know of an organizational change or particularly a technology change that has ever been described as seamless. And so I'm very impressed kind of how organizations, how quickly they moved. I think leaders were surprised how quickly they moved. One leader said 4 years worth of technological transition occurred in 2 weeks. And I don't think that was an exaggeration. I think they were being very candid. So a lot of those barriers about what we won't, those just disappeared relatively overnight. If we look at the survey results from the team this morning, participants 75% agreed with this question as well. A couple of people were more neutral or disagreed, but again, it's very impressive what organizations, and surprising what organizations have been able to do in this moment of real significant change. Now, overall, there was less certainty that this new normal was going to represent, as John said, significant structural or process changes. There was more agreement amongst financial services leaders, about 40%, that agreed with this question. But there's this kind of conflict between we've changed a ton, we made this big shift, and then we might, at least at this time, we might get back to business as usual at some point. And that could present some challenges in the weeks and months to come as there's that tension point. Certainly there's going to be leaders who want to come back, employees who want to get back to kind of the normal ways of working. There'll be folks who are really happy with this new normal. And again, trying to manage those expectations, those preferences, and really the realities of the business, I think will be clear here. The reality, though, is that shift to remote working was very dramatic. And there isn't necessarily that same drive or need to be as quick to jump back in, or even the ability to be quick to jump back in. And so there's an opportunity for this more measured, thoughtful approach in terms of how you move forward. And again, we've heard both employees who are dying to get back in and those who really love working from home going forward and would prefer that. And so the last one, kind of adding to this fuzzier picture, is this result that, again, how work gets done might shift. And so based on the comments we've had and discussions we've had with clients, it seems that those processes and approaches, the ways of working, again, will continue to shift even if the structures don't. So where work gets done, how work gets done is different, even if the folks that are doing those or the way the organization's designed is fairly consistent, at least for now. When we looked at the results from folks today, it was 50% agreed with that or strongly agreed that there would be fundamentally different approaches to work, 38% in that neutral zone, and 12% disagreed. So again, about the same in terms of that, anticipating things would be very different going forward. And we recognize that can be very different in industry, in location, corporate locations versus branch locations. Different roles may require different levels of change. So again, the crisis really went more smoothly than we thought, given how sudden things went. But that pandemic really, while people didn't have plans for it, it removed a lot of barriers and resistance and assumptions around status quo. Again, leaders had to really shift their thinking, or had it shifted for them. And this is something we work with a lot of teams on. They talk about how good they are in a crisis. And that's important. Obviously, the alternative is much, much worse. But we also see a crisis being kind of that substitute for leadership. And the opportunity here then is to make sure that leaders are finding ways to create urgency and alignment and direction, not only when there's this clear burning platform or just a forced hand, but how do you actually learn from these opportunities to bring folks together, get them clear on where things are going and why they're going that way. And so while many believe that there may be no changes to structure, again, the processes, the how work gets done is going to change. And this is a place where we work with a lot of teams who found this as a great opportunity to set some time aside and reset how they're going to work, how they're going to make decisions and delegate, what's going to be their priority, how they're going to interact. We find people connecting even on leadership teams more frequently, more informally, and they're saying, we need to keep this, like we got to keep this up, or we just spent months focusing on only the important stuff as a leadership team. We can't fall back into the habits of working at lower levels or taking on problems that the leadership team doesn't need to solve. Let's find a way to reset and stick with this. And John, I know you've had some experience with the senior leadership team, even with the credit union, that did a reset that was similar.
Consultants love to have all the ideas, but sometimes clients have great ideas. We steal them, repackage them, and use them. And any consultant who doesn't tell you that's the truth isn't telling the truth. We had a client approach us and say, we're through the crisis. We would like to figure out a way to almost codify or learn from the crisis so that we can move forward and make sure that we really learn mostly good lessons from what the change we had to go through. So we, working with them, designed what we called the pivot meeting. And please feel free to use this. You don't need a consultant to actually do this meeting if you have someone who can be a good facilitator. What we did is we designed a meeting, what we called the exhale meeting. People were holding their breath. People hold their breath sometimes during a crisis. And sometimes a whole organization can be holding its breath, hoping that we can move from working in the office to being virtual, that we can serve members at a branch. How can we serve them virtually if they can't come into the branch? Well, this credit union was doing mortgage closings and drive-throughs. I'm sure most of the people that are participating today figured out ways to get mortgages done without a lot of one-on-one personal interaction that you're typically used to. So we designed a meeting that said, what did we learn about ourselves as an organization? What mistakes did we make? Let's be honest, what mistakes did we make and what did we learn from the mistakes? Who were the employees that really stepped up in this crisis that surprised us, that we didn't see coming? Who were the people that really helped drive the change in the organization? And we designed an entire meeting around allowing the senior leadership team to exhale, to put their shoulders back on their back, to take a moment and reflect on what they had accomplished. And we had them document all that. Then we had what we call the pivot meeting, where you take a deep breath before you're going to start another journey. We called it the inhale meeting. So we had an exhale meeting, relax. Then this pivot point, now at inhale meeting, let's take a deep breath because we're going to start up again. What can we take from what we learned in the crisis at a macro level about leadership, about priorities, about communication, about expectations? And how can we apply that to our business going forward? And then how can we communicate with our employees that while there's still remnants of the crisis here, we're an ongoing concern. We're a healthy organization. We're going to be moving forward. And this changed the tone of the communication within the credit union, which was very positive, to more of a sustainable. What are our short, mid, and long-term goals going to be? So using our 5 disciplines, they went back to the strategy and said, what's our strategic intent? But let's look at that evolve the business. What have we learned through the change? And how can we apply that to our structures? Do we need to change anything? To how we communicate, mobilizing stakeholders, and how we're going to drive results. So that's a pivot meeting. It's a great opportunity for your HR functions or your learning and development functions to design a meeting around learning, adult learning, just-in-time learning, action learning, as you do a debrief. But it's not just a debrief and then you put it on the shelf. It's a debrief and how can we bring that learning into infusing our leaders, our managers, and our supervisors with better tools to really engage the employees in a way that's different from and better than we used to do. The other thing that I would say, and Ben, I'll throw it back to you, personnel changes have been happening since April. Both Ben and I have worked with clients where senior executives have been released for poor performance. We've worked with organizations that have hired senior level people onto mission critical roles, having never met them in person. All the interviews were done virtually. All the onboarding was done virtually, and the first 90 days have been done virtually. Employees who are not meeting expectations are being terminated. New employees are being brought in. The cadence is different, but work continues despite the fact that people are not face to face. Ben, anything you'd want to add to that?
No, John, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that was a question that we might anticipate, just how has both the management of talent and the acquisition of talent shifted. And, people are being interviewed, as you said, and met and managed and onboarded virtually. And we've found that people are just adapting, right? The resilience of people's ability to kind of fall in and find a new way of being effective has been the story for the most part of the folks we've worked with. I will also actually at this point turn it over to John for any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen and see if any other questions might have come in.
So there's two Johns here. I think we're talking about the most important John, which is John Bredsake.
Sure, I got too many JBs here.
I don't know about that, guys. So I will say one of the things that you guys were just touching on, and this came up yesterday in one of the questions, was about how credit unions are, or how just in general, right, hiring. And John, I've been fortunate to be, I guess a victim or a participant in, organizational talent reviews. And I know going through that, when organizations are focused and disciplined on reviewing and talking about change and how, your team can adapt to change and the different variables that go within that, it just seems that this has accelerated that at such a level as people are moving forward. How do you think that's changed, I guess, going forward, right? As far as those kind of the top 3 skill sets that somebody's going to have to help make the organization better.
So great. That's a great question and a really important and valid concern. We actually are seeing regularly scheduled talent reviews happen on time. So that's an organizational priority that isn't changing. So regular talent reviews. And I think, John, the other thing that we're seeing is less emphasis on, this is ironic, less emphasis on performance and more emphasis on adaptability for change. And when we think about credit unions and the technology changes, the competitive nature that fintech, other banks, other financial services are putting on credit unions, the need to be get into the digital age, be agile. Members' expectations are increasing all the time. The ability to change and adapt is really, really important. So that becomes one of the competencies that organizations are really looking for. Is, I know this person's smart, but can they learn? Can they grow? Can they change? Can they keep pace? Ben, any reaction to that?
I think oftentimes we found that competency was driven by a particular initiative. So we're doing this thing, so we need people who are agile. And now I think it's more being widely accepted as this is a critical part of leading our business, period, now and in the future. And so it's not just because we're going through a core conversion, it's because things are going to be unsettled and unrest for a while. And we need those people ready.
That's great. So we don't have any questions right now from the group, but I know that it seems we get them as we move forward. So what I'll do, gentlemen, is thank you very much. I know, Ben, we will say goodbye for today. John, we'll see you this afternoon at 1 o'clock when we reconvene for our panel discussion in the afternoon. So gentlemen, thank you.
So before we ring off, we do want to thank you, John, and all the participants. We also want to thank Crystal, Karen, Lee, and Michelle for all the work they've done behind the scenes to make this really easy to do. So thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you. Yeah, they're the real workers of this whole thing. So thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Take care.